Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to talk to you about the year when I only read books by women. Right, before I get started, I think there are probably two types of people watching this video. So the first type is people who've seen the thumbnail and thought, that sounds interesting, I'll see what he has to say. So if you're from that group, welcome. You may be a subscriber to the channel already, you may be a new viewer, but whatever, welcome. I hope you enjoy the video. Let me know what you think in the comments, we can have a chat about it. The second type of person who I think will be watching this video is the type of person who seems to emerge from the internet whenever I post a video that talks in any way about trying to read diversely or trying to prioritise books by a certain group of people. So you've probably seen that thumbnail and thought, it's a damn wokey. I'm going to go and attack him in the comments. So feel free to do that. That's fine. Go into the comments and tell me that I'm virtue signalling. Tell me that I'm being sexist by only reading books by women rather than reading books by men as well. Do whatever you want. You've already watched the adverts at the start of this video, so I've already got your money to build my woke empire and destroy the patriarchy. Thank you. Right, let's move on then. So at the end of every year, I think about what books I'm going to be reading in the following year. I don't necessarily set grand goals every year or anything like that, but I have a think about it. And at the end of 2017, I was doing that for 2018. So at that point, it was long before I had a YouTube channel, but I used to write reviews online and things like that. And I was starting to think about, what do I want to do in 2018? How do I want to frame my reading for the year? Now, if you cast your mind back to 2017, that was when the revelations about Harvey Weinstein started, coming out. And it became apparent, some of the terrible, terrible things he'd done, which are still in the news today. So just in the news this week, he was charged with, additional charges of rape and things like that. But it was 2017 when that really started to come out, and when the Me Too movement started. And it was very much in the public consciousness, as was right, and it was something I was thinking about. And I remember reading an interview I think it was in The Guardian, with the actress Minnie Driver, where she talked about the Weinstein case and the Me Too movement and the kind of things that were going on. And there was a quote in there that really stuck with me. So I've actually got it here, so I'll read it out to you. She said, I've realised that most men, good men that I love, there is a cut-off in their ability to understand. They simply cannot understand what abuse is like on a daily level. And I thought about that, and I thought, yeah, that's probably true. I probably don't understand what it's like to be constantly subjected to, the kind of leering catcalls, to unwanted sexual advances, and, all that kind of thing, the whole spectrum of things that women in our society are faced with every day. I don't understand that. And I thought, what can I do about it? Well, there's probably not a great deal I can do about it on a practical level, but what I can do is try and understand it more. And so, tying that in with setting my reading goals for the following year, I decided that I would spend a year only reading books by women. So I went into 2018 with the goal of spending a whole year reading books purely by female authors. And I achieved it, or I almost achieved it. So I read one book by a man in that year, and I'll talk about that book a bit later. I read that book for a specific reason, so I'll get to it in a bit. But in this kind of planning for my reading for the year, I also looked at my Goodreads. So I've used Goodreads for a number of years, and had at that point been using it for a number of years. And I'd also gone back and tried to remember as many of the books I'd read previously as I could, and log those on Goodreads. So at that point on Goodreads, I had 1,100 books or thereabouts logged as read. And when I went through that list, I discovered that of that 1,100, only 116 of them were by female authors, which didn't necessarily surprise me, because I knew I had a bias towards reading male authors. And that wasn't like a conscious bias, but the kind of genres that I enjoy, crime, horror, kind of adventure type fiction, the kind of 70s spy thrillers and things like that, and more likely to be written by men. Not exclusively written by men, and clearly there are a lot of very successful female authors in the crime genre in particular. But, you know, generally speaking, the kinds of books I was reading were more, the big authors were more likely to be men. And when I dug into it a bit more, I actually saw that when I looked at 4 authors who I'd read a lot of books by, who I was, you know, a big fan of, I'd actually read more books by those 4 men than by all female authors. Yeah, so those authors were Ed McBain, who I love to this day, Stephen King, who I mostly love to this day. You know, he's not always great, is he? But bless him, he's written some real classics, and he's still capable of writing good books. And then also in my kind of teens and 20s, I was really into kind of techno thrillers and adventure books and stuff like that. So I'd also had a lot of books by Tom Clancy and Clive Cussler. So those 4 guys, I'd read more books by them than I had by female authors. And I thought, that doesn't feel very balanced, does it? You know, I'm reading what I enjoy, but I'm doing it without thinking about it necessarily. And, you know, maybe I should address this. So as I say, I set 2018 as a year when I would only read books by women. So I ended up reading in that year 140 books by women, and as I say, 1 book by a man. And I'll put up on the screen, I'll kind of scroll through my Goodreads page for that year. But I read all sorts of different things. I read, you know, the kind of things you'd expect me to read in terms of reading. You know, I read a lot of crime, I read some horror, I read a fair bit of sci-fi, I read a bit of non-fiction, a bit of general fiction. I read quite a lot of books by indie authors. So I was reviewing for a website at that point, and I was getting, you know, books sent to me by indie authors. So I read a lot of books by female indie authors, which I really enjoy, particularly in the horror space. I read a few books that I'd had for ages and hadn't got round to, like The Secret History by Donna Tartt, The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. So, you know, a real mix of different stuff. And I really, really enjoyed it. And what I didn't find was that it was difficult. It was difficult in the sense that there were a couple of projects I'd been doing where I was reading particular series of books. So I was doing a read through of the 87th Precinct series by McBain, and I was doing a read through of the Dark Tower, like an extended read through of the Dark Tower series by Stephen King as well. So clearly I had to pause those for 2018, and that was a bit of a wrench because I was quite enjoying those, but I was able to pick them up afterwards and continue with them, so that was fine. But I didn't find that I ever lacked something enjoyable to read. It was never a struggle for me to read, you know, to find something to read that I was looking forward to reading. And as I say, I read 140 books, and it was a rewarding reading year. Was every book I read brilliant? No, of course it wasn't. There were some that were absolute stinkers. But, you know, it was still an interesting and enjoyable experience, and I didn't have a higher percentage of stinkers than I do in any other year. Just because I was focusing my reading in a particular area, it didn't make that reading less enjoyable in any way. And I reflected back on it at the end of that year, so at the kind of end of 2018, beginning of 2019, I looked back at the books I'd read throughout the year and tried to think about, you know, what felt different about it? What was there anything different about it? Did it feel different from my normal diet of books, which was, you know, as you've seen from those stats, 116 to 1100. So what would that be? So it'd be like 116 books by women to almost 1,000 books by men. So, you know, a real unbalance. So did it feel different? And yeah, it did. It didn't feel worse. It didn't feel less enjoyable. But there were definitely different themes that came out through that reading. And there were, what I ended up doing at the end of 2019 was writing an article about it, which got published at the time. Unfortunately, the website it was on is no longer online, so you can't read it. But I laid my thoughts out. And what I found was there was one big difference. So there was one thing that felt very different about the stuff that I was reading. And then there were a number of small differences. Yeah, so there were like 3 or 4 things that were noticeably different, but didn't feel like an overwhelming thing. So let me talk about those small differences first. So the first one was, and this is probably quite an obvious one, there were a lot more female protagonists. So it wasn't exclusively female protagonists, but there were a lot more female protagonists than I was used to. So, you know, in reading books, you think about people like Stephen King, Ed McBain, Clancy, Cussler, you know, they have heroes. They have male heroes who are, you know, doing their thing, solving crimes, defeating spy plots and stuff like that. So, the kind of typical macho thriller type stuff. So definitely more female protagonists. The second thing is there was more sex. So there was definitely more sex in my reading in 2018 than I was used to, which isn't a bad thing, but it was definitely a noticeable difference. So more books with bedroom shenanigans than I would normally read. And indeed, one of the books I read in 2018 was 50 Shades of Grey, which was one of the stinkers, but I thought it would be an interesting book to read because it was so popular, particularly with a female readership. So the third difference then is there was less action but more violence. So if you think about the kind of books I've talked about, like the kind of Clive Cussler and Tom Clancy, those kind of thrillers, there's lots of action in those books. There's lots of bits where characters get what they want through force, and normally kind of righteous force. So the hero going after the baddie and shooting him and so on and so forth. So lots of action, but it felt like it didn't feel, it's the kind of action that doesn't feel real. So the kind of action you get in action movies and TV shows where it's there for entertainment, but it's not what violence is like in the real world. Whereas the books I was reading in 2018, there was less of that kind of thing, less righteous action, but more realistic violence. So when violence happened in those books, it felt a lot more real. It felt like real people were getting hurt, and you felt their distress and their pain. And then the final difference was there was more conversation and more people talking about their feelings and externalizing their feelings through talking and solving problems through talking. So more conversation, but less dialogue. So one of the kind of traits, if you like, of crime fiction, and particularly the kind of crime fiction I enjoy, is that kind of snappy dialogue where, two cops will bounce ideas off each other and things like that. So less of that, but more people having, real conversations about things and actually talking about how they felt about each other, how they felt about other people. That kind of conversational dialogue, which is less stylized and I guess a bit richer and a bit more realistic than the kind of dialogue I enjoy in crime fiction. So that really was the fourth difference. So those were the small things. The big thing was, and maybe this is in part because I read, I embarked on this year in the wake of the Me Too movement, and with that very much in my mind as I started reading the year. But the thing that overwhelmingly came away for me from the books that I read was this sense of male violence against women. So this sense of the constant threat of male violence and of male, not necessarily even violence, just aggression. And as I said at the start, unwanted attention and things like that. And in some of the books, it was a big thing. I read some crime books that year where, that were about, the murder of women by men. So in those cases, it was a big thing. But in lots of the other books as well, even the books that weren't crime books, it came up again and again as a kind of small theme. So the fact that female characters were having to put up with things that they weren't comfortable with from male characters in the books. And it ranged from big things to small things, but it felt like a really persistent theme. So that was the overwhelming thing I took away, I think, was this sense of kind of male entitlement of the male characters in these books feeling like they could do what they wanted, by and large, to the female characters. So that was interesting, and certainly seemed to me to kind of feed back to that quote from Minnie Driver, about that being something that women are just used to, that it just infuses every part of everyday life for many women, and that men are quite oblivious to. So I said at the start there was one book I read by a man that year. And it was a book I really enjoyed. And as I said, it was a book I read for a very specific reason. So the reason I read it was I won it in a giveaway where it was someone on Instagram, a Bookstagram person, who was doing this giveaway, and they were hosting a read-along for this book. And they were in the States, and I won, and they had to post it to me from the States, and it cost them a fortune. It cost like 3 times as much as the book cost for them to send it to me. So I felt like I really ought to read it. I felt like I'd be being a bit of a dick if I didn't read it. And I did read it, and I did enjoy it. The book was A Boy's Life by Robert McCammon, which I know is a much loved book. I hear people on, kind of the horror side of BookTube talking about it a lot and saying how much they like it. And the thing that really struck me about that book, and maybe it's obvious from the title, yeah? So to read a book called A Boy's Life in the midst of a year, and I think it was about halfway through the year I read it, so in the midst of the year when I was only reading books by female authors, to read a book that is very much focused on like the male side of things was quite jarring. I really noticed how male that book felt. And in particular, and as I say, I think it's a really good book. I really enjoyed it. And it's a much loved book. But it felt overwhelmingly male to me. And it felt like there were some wonderfully drawn, richly painted male characters in that book. There's a guy who had lived in the old West and tells fantastic stories and things like that. There's the father of the main character. There's the main character himself, who's this boy. All really interesting, convincing, 3-dimensional characters. Whereas the female characters felt much less interestingly described, and it felt to an extent like the author didn't really care about them. A lot of them were stereotypes, to be honest with you. So there's like the mom character is just really mommy. She's just really, very maternal. Just, she's baking and worrying about her son and things like that. There's a like teacher characters and things like that who are just like cookie cutter female teachers from I think the book's set in like the 50s, from the 50s. So yeah, it felt quite disappointing in terms of the depiction of female characters in that book compared to everything else I'd been reading that year. It felt like it was really lacking, and it was really, really very apparent to me that it was written by a man rather than by a woman. So, time for a random book from the shelves. Today by a very famous female author. It's a book I haven't yet read, which I really need to. Everyone keeps telling me I need to read it, and I haven't, so apologies. So it's Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which I do mean to read. I've had this copy I think I probably had this copy since I did that year of reading books by female authors, but it didn't make the cut for whatever that year. So yes, definitely one I need to get to. So I hope you found that interesting. Let me know in the comments any reflections you've got on what I've said. Let me know if you've ever done anything similar yourself. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're safe and well out there. I hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.